She had seen Jim act before, but being around him every day was different. She liked him more than most women did. He was beautiful. He had dark eyes and a cocky swagger, but she said he was also screwy. She said that half the time you couldn't even talk to him because he was high on whatever he had taken that day, alcohol, drugs, coke, you name it. Grace wasn't sober at the time, but Jim took it to a whole new level. One night in London at the Belgravia Hotel, Grace decided to take a chance. She'd been watching Jim and felt that pull that many women feel, so she went to his room and knocked on the door using Jefferson Airplane's secret knock, a little rhythm they all knew. Jim didn't know it, but he opened the door anyway and flashed that famous smile. What happened next was pure 60s chaos. They didn't just hook up, they turned the room into a playground and smeared each other with strawberries, grapes, or whatever fruit the hotel had left out. They laughed and rolled around like kids. Grace said it was like making love to a moving work of art with eyes. She also said Jim was well-built and bigger than average, and she wasn't afraid to say she liked it. But here's where things get bittersweet. After that wild night, Grace left his room and said, "Call me if you want." Grace Slick was a woman who lived by her own rules, so she wasn't needy. But Jim never called, not the next day, not ever. She laughed about it later, saying, "Apparently I'm a terrible lay." It hurt a little, though, because she'd felt something, even if it was just a spark in the heat of the moment. Jim, on the other hand, just moved on, lost in his own haze. He was too far gone to care about anyone for long, but that wasn't the end of their story. Later on the tour in Amsterdam, they had another moment where the bands were hanging out and someone got a chunk of Lebanese gold hashish. Grace and the plane crew offered some to Jim, but most of them kept it for later. Jim didn't wait, he sat down on the curb and ate a huge piece right there, chasing it with whatever else fans had given him, pot hash pills. Jim stumbled onto the stage during the Jefferson Airplane set that night and started singing with Grace while wrapping his arms around her and swaying like they were in a dreamy dance. The crowd went crazy, but then Jim danced off stage to the dressing room and passed out cold. Grace thought it was funny, but she also saw that he was a mess. Grace wasn't shocked when Jim died in 1971. He was only 27 years old and was found dead in a Paris apartment, most likely from a mix of drugs and alcohol. She had lost other friends to that life, like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, but Jim's death hit her differently. She had always thought it was a miracle he made it that far because he used himself as a human guinea pig. She said that her thing was to see how much a brain and body could handle. She loved drugs and acid, and she wrote White Rabbit while she was high on them, but she had limits. Jim didn't, he'd take anything, anywhere, at any time. Grace once said she never got high on acid because she didn't have any mental health issues to begin with. Jim, on the other hand, she thought he was running away from something darker. Years later, when Grace got sober in the 90s, she started painting. Guess who showed up in her work? Jim Morrison. She did a full-body portrait of him shirtless, arms out like a rock and roll Jesus. Another sketch called Pretty Boy captured his face, those sharp cheekbones and brooding eyes. She didn't paint him out of bitterness. I liked Jim. She said he was gorgeous but so screwy. It was her way of keeping him alive, a nod to that wild night and the wild man she couldn't forget even at 85. Talking about him brought out her old punk spirit, that mix of humor and rebellion that made her a legend. Their fling wasn't some big romance, it was a flash, a crazy moment in a crazy time, but it says a lot about who they were. Grace was bold, fearless, always ready to push boundaries. Jim was a storm, beautiful and destructive, pulling people in and then slipping away. Together they were like fire and gasoline, burning bright for one night. Grace exposed more than just the details of their hookup. She showed us Jim unfiltered through her eyes, a guy who howled at the moon, smeared strawberries on hotel walls, and lived like every day was his last. And for her at 85, it's still a story worth telling that Europe Tour wasn't just about music or sex though. It was a snapshot of the 60s at their peak. Jefferson Airplane and the Doors were more than bands, they were symbols of a generation saying no to rules, no to war, no to anything that didn't feel free. Grace and Jim fit right into that. She'd plot to spike Nixon's tea with LSD a couple years later and Jim would get arrested for flashing a crowd. They weren't saints, they were rock stars living loud and messy. That night in London with the strawberries and the laughter was them in their element. Grace's life didn't end with the 60s of course. She kept singing, first with Jefferson Airplane and then Jefferson Starship. They had hits in the 1980s, like Why Build This City? She hated that. By the way, the song called it a mistake from when she was clean, but the wild Grace, the one who raced cars and fought cops, never really went away, she just channeled it in a different way. By the time she quit music, she'd seen it all: fame, drugs, loss, and victory. Jim didn't get that chance. He burned out quickly, leaving behind myths and mysteries. Looking back, Grace doesn't sugarcoat it. She calls rock and roll people spoiled brats who are obsessed with fun, money, and who they can sleep with. She was one of them, and she owns it. Her night with Jim was just one part of that life, but she keeps talking about it. Maybe it's because it was so raw and real, or maybe it's because Jim was the perfect guy she could have clicked with but never got the chance to meet. At 85, she still has that spark and is ready to shock us with a story that's equal parts funny, dirty, and a little sad. The world's changed since 1968. The hippie days are long gone and most of the icons from back then are either dead or faded. Grace is one of the last standing, a living link to a time when music could start a revolution. Her Jim Morrison story isn't just gossip, it's a window into that era, into two people who lived it harder than most. She's not spilling tea to trash him, she's painting a picture messy and wild just like they were. And at 85 she's still got the guts to tell it like it is. Gray Slick's memory of Jim Morrison isn't just a one-night tale, it's layered with all the chaos and color of the I-60s rock scene. After that wild night in London their paths kept crossing on the Europe tour and every encounter added a new brushstroke to her picture of him. She didn't chase him or pine for more, but she couldn't help noticing how he moved through the world like a comet, bright and doomed to crash at 85. Looking back she's blunt about it. Jim was a genius, a lunatic and a walking disaster. All rolled into one. Take the Amsterdam show for instance. That moment when Jim crashed Jefferson Airplane, said it wasn't planned, it was pure Morrison. Grace was belting out a song, probably Somebody to Love, when he staggered on stage high as a kite from that Lebanese gold hash he'd gobbled down. He grabbed her, started singing or slurring right into the mic with her. His arms were around her waist, his head swaying like he was about to fall over. The crowd lost it, screaming and cheering, feeding off the madness. Grace didn't push him off. She went with it and matched his energy for a minute. Then he spun away, danced off stage, and passed out in the dressing room. She laughed about it later with her friends, but she still felt like he's not going to last. Jim's unpredictability wasn't just a party trick, it was who he was. Grace saw it up close night after night. One minute he'd be charming, reciting poetry in that deep voice of his, the next he'd be screaming at a roadie or passed out in a corner. She'd been around plenty of wild characters, her own band wasn't exactly tame, but Jim stood out. He didn't just live on the edge, he leapt off it over and over. Grace liked that about him, even if it scared her a little. She was no stranger to pushing limits. Herself, acid trips, arrests, all part of her story, but she always came back to earth. Jim didn't seem to want to off stage, he was just as intense. Grace remembers a night in Germany after a show when the bands were crashing at some cheap hotel. She was in the lobby smoking a cigarette when Jim came stumbling in, shirtless and ranting about Enzi or some other philosopher he was obsessed with. He saw her, grinned and plopped down next to her, still talking a mile a minute. She didn't say much, just listened. Nodding along, he smelled like whiskey and sweat and his eyes were glassy, but there was something magnetic about him. He could have been a professor, she said later, if he wasn't so busy trying to kill himself. That mix of brilliance and self-destruction fascinated her. Their fling in London didn't repeat itself, though. Grace wasn't the type to beg for attention and Jim wasn't the type to give it. She'd catch his eye sometimes across a room backstage in a van and he'd flash that smile, but that was it. She didn't mind I got my piece of him, she said with a shrug. For her it was enough a memory to tuck away like a souvenir from a crazy trip, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Jim was slipping away. Even back then he wasn't just wild, he was fragile like a glass sculpture teetering on a ledge. The tour wrapped up and the bands went their separate ways. Jefferson Airplane kept climbing, riding the wave of hits and hippie fame. The Doors did too for a while, until Jim's spiral got worse. Grace heard the stories: arrests, cancelled shows, fights with his own band. She wasn't shocked when the news broke in '71 that he'd died. She was in San Francisco, probably painting or jamming with Paul Nur, when someone told her, Paris. Hush, she said, figures he'd go out somewhere fancy. She didn't cry, she'd seen it coming, but she felt the weight of it. Another light from her world snuffed out too soon. When Grace talked about Jim again decades later, it wasn't to settle old scores or find out what happened. She was 85 years old, living quietly in Malibu, drawing and thinking about a life that could fill 10 books. Although her hair was graying and her voice was higher, her mind was as sharp as ever. She would always smile as she told the Morrison story at art shows or interviews. She would say that he was a crazy person, but a beautiful one. She didn't romanticize him. To her, he was just Jim, the guy who barked like a dog and made a hotel room a fruity mess. Her paintings of him say more than her words ever could. That full-body portrait with Jim's arms outstretched captures the way he'd command a stage, like he was daring the universe to take him down. The pretty boy sketch zooms in on his face, all shadows and angles, a hint of that lost look she'd seen in his eyes. Grace didn't paint him to mourn him, she painted him because he was part of her story, a small part maybe, but one that stuck. I don't miss him, she said once. I missed the '60s, he was just there. The thing is, Grace and Jim were cut from the same cloth. Even if their threads unraveled differently, they both thrived in that lawless, mind-bending era. Her with her acid-laced lyrics, him with his shamanic stage antics. They both loved the rush of breaking rules. She once tried to dose the president. He got busted for exposing himself in Miami, but Grace had a knack for survival. She quit drugs, quit music, found a new life in art. Jim didn't or couldn't. At 85 she sees that difference clear as day. I knew when to stop, she said. He didn't. Their story isn't some epic love affair, it's a footnote in the bigger tale of rock's golden age, but it's a hell of a footnote. Grace exposing Jim isn't about spilling secrets, it's about tearing down the myth. He wasn't just the lizard king or the tortured poet, he was a guy who ate hash on the side of the road, danced with her on stage, and left strawberry stains on a hotel bed. He was flawed, funny, and falling apart, and at 85, Grace is still here to tell it like it was. That Europe tour with its smoky venues and late-night chaos seems like a lifetime ago. Most of the people who were there, fans, musicians, are gone. Grace is one of the few people who can remember a time when music was a weapon, a drug, and a religion. Her story about Jim Morrison isn't just about him, it's also about her, the woman who matched his fire for a night and kept it going long after he died at 85. She still has that edge, ready to laugh at how silly everything is, and Jim is still the screwy, beautiful ghost in her rearview mirror.